The air in the intensive care unit smelled of sterile latex and slow-motion death. Ethan sat by the bed, the rhythmic hiss-click of the ventilator, the only sound in the room. On the bed lay Thomas Miller, a man who had been a titan of the American tobacco industry for 40 years, a man who had provided Ethan with everything: private schools, a New York apartment, a life without friction, but at the cost of 1,000 miles of emotional distance. "Dad?" Ethan whispered. Thomas's eyes snapped open. They weren't the eyes of a dying man. They were wide, bloodshot, and filled with a primal, suffocating terror. He grabbed Ethan's wrist with a strength that shouldn't have been possible. His mouth moved, dry lips cracking, gasping for air that his lungs could no longer process. "The debt," Thomas wheezed. "Ethan, don't let them in!" His body convulsed once, a sharp, jagged movement, and then he went still. The heart monitor flatlined, a piercing, continuous scream of electronics. Ethan stood there, frozen. The nurses wouldn't be in for another few seconds. He looked at his father's face. Those eyes were still wide open, staring at something just behind Ethan's shoulder. With a trembling hand, Ethan reached out to close his father's eyelids. The moment his skin touched Thomas's forehead, a jolt of static electricity, colder than ice, seared through his palm. For a split second, the hospital room flickered. The white walls turned into rotting wood, and the smell of ozone replaced the scent of bleach. Ethan recoiled, gasping. The room was normal again. His father was dead. But as Ethan looked down at his own hand, his palm felt numb, as if a part of him had died along with the old man. He didn't know it yet, but the veil had just been torn, and in the Miller estate back in Ohio, the staff was already preparing for his arrival. The drive to the outskirts of Blackwood, Ohio, was a blur of gray highways and skeletal trees. Ethan pulled his SUV into the long gravel driveway of the Miller estate, a massive, Victorian-style manor that his father had bought and renovated years ago. It sat like a silent sentry amidst acres of private woodland, far from the prying eyes of neighbors. Ethan stepped out, the gravel crunching under his boots. The house felt heavier than he remembered. He had spent his summers here, but it never felt like home. It felt like a monument to his father's ambition. As he fumbled with his keys at the front door, it swung open before he could even touch the lock. "Welcome home, Mr. Ethan." Ethan jumped, his heart hammering against his ribs. Standing in the foyer was a woman in a crisp, black and white maid's uniform. Her hair was pulled back into a bun so tight it seemed to stretch the skin on her face. "Mrs. Gable?" Ethan stammered. I thought you retired years ago, right after I started college." The woman gave a thin, bloodless smile. "The master called us back, sir. He wanted to make sure you were looked after once he transitioned." Ethan frowned. He remembered Mrs. Gable. She had been his nanny for a time, then the head housekeeper. But she looked exactly the same as she did 10 years ago. Not a single new wrinkle. He stepped inside, and the smell hit him. The scent of fresh pine wax and slow-cooked pot roast. The house was immaculate. In the kitchen, he saw movement. A man in overalls. Marcus, the old groundskeeper, was passing by the window with a pair of shears. In the dining room, a table was already set for one. "We've prepared your favorite, sir," Mrs. Gable said, gesturing toward the dining hall. "Pot roast with root vegetables. You look thin. You need to eat." "How did you even know I was coming today?" Ethan asked, shedding his coat. "I didn't call ahead." "We always know when a Miller is coming home," she replied softly. Ethan sat at the massive mahogany table. The house was unnervingly quiet, yet it felt crowded. Every time he turned his head, he caught a glimpse of a shadow disappearing around a corner, or the hem of a uniform ducking into the pantry. He picked up his fork, but his hand felt heavy. that same numbness from the hospital still lingering in his palm. He took a bite of the meat. It was tender, perfectly seasoned, and yet, as he chewed, he felt a strange lack of satisfaction. It was like eating a memory. All the flavor was there, but none of the substance. Outside, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, claw-like shadows across the lawn. Ethan looked out the window and saw Marcus, the groundskeeper, standing perfectly still in the middle of the garden, staring directly up at Ethan's window. He wasn't waving. He wasn't working. He was just waiting. The first week at the estate felt like a dream, or more accurately, a sedative. Ethan didn't have to lift a finger. If he left a coffee mug on a side table, it vanished the moment he looked away, only to reappear clean and steaming in the kitchen. His clothes were laundered, pressed, and smelling faintly of lavender and old earth. Mrs. Gable was always there, appearing silently in doorways with a glass of water or a tray of snacks. "You're working too hard, Ethan," she would whisper, though he hadn't touched his laptop in days. "Rest. Let us take care of everything." He found himself sleeping for 12, 14 hours at a time. He would wake up at 2 p.m., his head heavy, only to find a full American breakfast waiting for him: eggs, bacon, sourdough toast. "Where is everyone else?" Ethan asked one afternoon as he watched Marcus, the groundskeeper, meticulously trim the hedges for the third time that day. "I remember a driver, a cook, a girl named Sarah who used to help in the kitchen." "They're all here, Ethan," Mrs. Gable replied, her eyes fixed on his. "They're just in the other rooms, doing their chores. You'll see them when it's their turn to serve." The logic felt fuzzy, like he was thinking through a thick fog. He began to notice the rotations. One morning it would be Mrs. Gable. The next, it was an old butler named Arthur whom Ethan vaguely remembered from his childhood. Then Sarah would appear, looking exactly as she did when Ethan was 15, braided hair, bright eyes, and a pale, waxen complexion. But the most unsettling thing was the silence. The staff never spoke to each other. They moved like clockwork, their footsteps making no sound on the hardwood floors. One evening, Ethan tried to leave. He felt a sudden, sharp burst of anxiety and decided he needed to drive into town just to see other people. People who didn't wear uniforms or smile with too many teeth. He grabbed his keys, but as he reached the front door, Arthur was already there holding Ethan's coat. "The roads are quite treacherous tonight, sir," Arthur said. His voice sounded like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "A storm is coming. Better to stay by the fire." "I'm just going for a quick drive, Arthur. It's fine." "We've already prepared the master bedroom, Ethan," Mrs. Gable said, appearing from the shadows of the hallway. "And your tea is getting cold. It would be a shame to waste it." Ethan looked from Arthur to Mrs. Gable. They weren't blocking the door, not exactly, but they stood with a terrifying stillness, their gaze heavy and expectant. "Right," Ethan muttered, his resolve melting away like wax. "The tea. I'll just have the tea." As he walked back toward the library, he glanced in the foyer mirror. He blinked, confused. He looked pale. His skin had a sickly, translucent quality, and his eyes seemed sunken. He looked like he was fading. Behind his reflection, he saw the staff. Mrs. Gable, Arthur, and Marcus were standing in a row in the dark hallway, watching his back. In the mirror's reflection, they didn't look like people at all. They looked like gray, flickering statues. But when he turned around, they were gone. Only the faint scent of pot roast and damp soil remained. By the second week, the fog in Ethan's mind had settled into his bones. He woke up one morning and tried to stand, but his knees buckled. He felt lighter, as if his very mass was evaporating. When he finally made it to the bathroom, he stripped off his shirt and gasped. His ribs were jutting out like the hull of a wrecked ship. His skin, once a healthy tan, was now the color of curdled milk, stretched tight over his collarbones. "I don't understand," he whispered to the hollow-cheeked man in the mirror. I'm eating 3 meals a day." He stumbled down to the kitchen, desperate for answers. He found Sarah, the young maid, stirring a pot of thick, hearty beef stew. The smell was heavenly rich, savory and warm. "Sarah," Ethan rasped, his voice cracking. "I feel sick. I think I need to see a doctor in the city." Sarah turned. She didn't look concerned, she looked hungry, not for the stew, but for the sight of him. "You're just adjusting, Mr. Ethan. The transition is hard on everyone. Here, eat. This will fix everything." She slid a bowl toward him. Ethan ate ravenously. The stew tasted like the best meal of his life, but as he swallowed, he felt a strange, hollow sensation in his stomach, like he was pouring water into a bucket with no bottom. 2 days later, Ethan's girlfriend, Maya, called. Her voice sounded like it was coming from a different planet. "Ethan? You sound terrible," Maya said, her voice laced with worry. "And why haven't you posted anything? Your boss at the firm called me. You haven't checked your email in 10 days. "I'm just busy with the estate, Maya," Ethan said. He was lying on the floor of the library because sitting in a chair required too much energy. "The staff, they're taking care of me." "Staff? Ethan, your dad let everyone go months before he died. He was broke. He spent every cent on consultants and medical trials. There is no staff." Ethan felt a cold spike of adrenaline. "No, they're here. Mrs. Gable, Marcus, they're in the room right now." He looked up. Mrs. Gable was standing 3 inches away from him, staring down with those unblinking, glassy eyes. She wasn't holding a tray. She was just watching him breathe. "Ethan, I'm coming down there," Maya said firmly. "I'll be there by Saturday. Don't go anywhere." The line went dead. Ethan tried to stand up, but his vision swam with black spots. He needed to get out. He managed to crawl toward the front door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He reached the foyer and saw Marcus standing by the door, holding his shears. "Going somewhere, sir?" Marcus asked. "I need medicine," Ethan choked out. "There's no medicine better than a home-cooked meal," Marcus replied. Ethan looked down at the floor and saw something that nearly made his heart stop. The sun was shining through the foyer window, casting a long shadow of Ethan onto the rug. But Marcus, who was standing right in the path of the light, cast no shadow at all. Neither did Mrs. Gable. They weren't people. They were echoes, and they were feeding. The sound of a car horn shattered the silence of the estate like a gunshot. Maya pulled her car into the driveway, her tires spitting gravel. She didn't wait for Ethan to come to the door. She ran up the porch steps and pounded on the wood. "Ethan, open up!" Inside, Ethan was slumped against the base of the stairs. He felt like a ghost inhabiting his own skin. He watched as Mrs. Gable moved toward the door, her movements fluid and unnatural. "I'll handle the guests, sir," Mrs. Gable whispered, her voice sounding like a hiss of steam. "She isn't part of the arrangement." "No!" Ethan screamed, though it came out as a weak wheeze. He used every ounce of strength to pull himself up and lunge for the handle. He swung the door open just as Mrs. Gable reached for it. Maya stepped back, a scream dying in her throat. "Ethan? Oh my God." To Maya, Ethan looked like a victim of a famine. His eyes were deep purple pits in his skull, and his skin was a sickly, translucent yellow. But more terrifying was what she didn't see. "Ethan, who are you talking to?" Maya asked, her voice trembling as she looked past him into the empty foyer. "Mrs. Gable." Ethan pointed a shaking finger at the space right in front of her. "She's standing right there." And Arthur? And Marcus? Maya's face went white. She looked directly at the spot where the head housekeeper stood, but her eyes saw nothing but the dusty air of a neglected house.
Ethan, there's no one there. The house is empty. It's covered in cobwebs. It looks like no one has lived here in years.
Ethan looked back. To his eyes, the house was pristine. The floors were polished, the chandelier was glowing. Mrs. Gable was staring at Maya with a look of pure, predatory hatred. "She's lying, sir," Mrs. Gable said, her jaw unhinging slightly further than a human's should. "She wants to take you away from your comforts. Eat. Just one more bite." Maya grabbed Ethan's arm. "We're going, now." She dragged him toward the car. As they crossed the threshold, Ethan looked back one last time. For a split second, his vision flickered. The veil his father had torn finally shredded. He didn't see a beautiful Victorian home. He saw a rotting carcass of a building. He didn't see a staff of loyal servants. He saw a dozen gray, shriveled husks standing on the porch, their mouths open in silent, hollow screams. Marcus wasn't holding shears. He was holding a rusted blade caked in old blood. The stew he had been eating wasn't food. On the dining table sat a bowl filled with black sludge and swarming flies. Maya threw him into the passenger seat and floored it. As they sped away, Ethan looked in the side mirror. The staff wasn't chasing them. They were just standing at the edge of the property line, fading into the mist, their eyes glowing with a faint, malevolent hunger. 2 hours later, Ethan was in a county hospital hooked up to an IV. The doctor sat Maya down, his expression grim. "I've never seen anything like this," the doctor said. "Medically, he's starving. His stomach is completely empty, yet his blood chemistry shows traces of something I can't identify. It's like his body was being tricked into thinking it was full while his organs were shutting down from lack of nutrients. If you had arrived 4 hours later, his heart would have simply stopped." Ethan lay in the bed, staring at the ceiling. He could still feel that cold numbness in his palm. He knew now what his father had done. The director's legacy wasn't money, it was a debt paid in life force. And the creditors were still waiting for the rest of their payment. Three days later, Ethan was stable enough to speak, but the fear hadn't left his eyes. He insisted Maya return to the estate one last time. Not to go inside, but to retrieve a heavy, fireproof lockbox his father had kept hidden in the floorboards of the detached garage. "Don't go into the house, Maya," Ethan pleaded from his hospital bed. "Please, just the garage. Get the box and leave." Maya did as she was told. When she returned to the hospital, they sat together and forced the box open. Inside weren't gold bars or secret deeds. It was a stack of old personnel files, dating back to the 1970s, and a leather-bound ledger written in his father's frantic, jagged handwriting. The files were for the staff. Mrs. Gable, died 1984. Cause, sudden heart failure on the estate grounds. Marcus Thorne, died 1991. Cause, accidental, fall into a wood chipper. Arthur Vance, died 1999. Cause, disappeared, later found in the estate's well. As Ethan flipped through the pages, the pattern became sickeningly clear. Every time his father's company was about to go under, or every time Thomas Miller was passed over for a promotion, a member of his staff died. They weren't just employees, they were insurance policies. The ledger revealed the truth. In 1975, Thomas Miller had visited a consultant in the deep Appalachian backwoods. He had entered into a pact, a blood contract known in occult circles as a tontine of the damned. The contract allowed Thomas to borrow the vitality and luck of those in his service. In exchange for a comfortable life under his roof, their souls were bound to the property. When they died, they didn't move on. They stayed to serve, their life force fueling Thomas's success, his health, and his bank account. "He wasn't a director," Ethan whispered, tears streaming down his face.
He was a parasite. He fed on them for 40 years.
The last entry in the ledger was dated just a week before his father's death. The debt is called. I have no one left to give. My wife is gone. My friends are gone. The staff is hungry, and they are tired of waiting. If I don't provide a fresh soul, they will take mine. But I fear even that won't be enough. Ethan realized with a jolt of horror why his father had grabbed his wrist so hard at the hospital. It wasn't a gesture of love. When Ethan closed his father's eyes, the ownership of the contract had been passed down through that jolt of static electricity. The staff hadn't been serving Ethan out of loyalty. They were grooming their new master, preparing to drain him dry just as his father had drained them. They were reclaiming 40 years of stolen life, one meal at a time.
Maya, Ethan said, his voice trembling. The doctor said I was starving, right? But I felt full. I felt satisfied.
The great deception, Maya whispered, reading from the ledger. The shadows feed the body illusions while they feast on the marrow. Ethan looked at his hand. The numbness was spreading to his arm. He realized that even though he was miles away from the house, the contract was still active. He was still the owner. And as long as he owned that land, the debt would continue to accrue interest. I have to get rid of it, Ethan said, his eyes turning cold. I have to break the chain.
How?
Maya asked.
You can't just burn it down. The ledger says the souls are bound to the deed, not the wood.
Ethan looked at the property documents. A dark, desperate idea began to form in his mind. I can't destroy the debt, but I can transfer it. Six months later, a young couple, the Harrisons, pulled their station wagon into the driveway of the Blackwood estate. The air was crisp, and the house, newly painted and professionally landscaped, looked like a suburban dream. To them, it was a steal. A sprawling historic manor at 40% below market value.
It's perfect, the wife whispered, looking at the towering oaks. I can't believe the owner was so eager to sell.
In a sleek apartment in downtown Chicago, Ethan sat by a window, watching the city lights. He looked healthy again. His cheeks were full, his eyes bright. The numbness in his hand was completely gone. On the table beside him lay a finalized wire transfer receipt for a staggering amount of money. But he didn't look happy. He looked like a man who had escaped a sinking ship by pushing someone else overboard. His phone buzzed. It was a text from the real estate agent. Closing is complete. The Harrisons just got the keys. They're moving in tonight. Congratulations on the sale, Ethan. Ethan closed his eyes. He remembered the last thing the consultant he'd sought out in secret had told him. The debt of a miller is a heavy thing. It can only be settled by blood or by a new signature on the deed. Once you sell, the staff is no longer your burden. They belong to the house, and the house belongs to the new master. Back at the estate, the sun began to set. Inside the house, the Harrisons were exploring their new kitchen. "Did you hear that?" the husband asked, pausing near the pantry. "Sounded like someone humming."
"Just the pipes, honey," his wife replied.
But as she turned around, she saw a woman in a crisp, black and white maid's uniform standing at the end of the hallway. The woman was holding a tray with 2 glasses of iced tea. "Welcome home," Mrs. Gable said, her smile wider and sharper than it had been in years. "I've prepared some refreshments. You both look so tired from the move. You really should eat." The husband and wife looked at each other, confused but charmed by the unexpected welcome. They didn't see the cobwebs forming in the corners of the ceiling. They didn't see the way the tea in the glasses looked like stagnant black water. In Chicago, Ethan deleted the agent's message and blocked the number. He walked over to his mirror and straightened his tie. For a split second, in the reflection, he saw his father standing behind him, smiling a cold, prideful smile. Ethan had done exactly what a miller would do. He had survived, he had profited, and he had passed the bill to someone else. The Miller legacy was safe,